Right, there we go. I think it's nearly 4 minutes past, so I think we're going to get started with our today's event. So firstly, hi to those of you who don't know me. Hi, I'm Kate. I'm the chair of UEA Labour. Today's event, Red is the New Green, is going to be talking about broadly sort of environmental policy on the left, but also with sort of a specific focus on the Green New Deal policy, which is obviously, sort of shot to fame, shot to prominence with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in America, and was later picked up by the Labour Party. We're going to be discussing what's really good about it, and also potentially some of its limitations, things we should be pushing for further radicalism on, that kind of thing. So we've got all of our panelists here. So do you guys want to introduce yourselves? So Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi, my name's Chris. Really glad to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. I guess I'm here in the capacity of, I'm one of the co-founders of Labour for a Green New Deal, currently the chair of the steering group. I've also been involved in kind of divestment campaigning, fossil-free finance campaigning, kind of climate justice direct action and stuff like that.
Brilliant. Leon, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for hosting me. I'm a scholar and activist based at the University of Warwick in Coventry. Have been working on and campaigning for climate justice for the past 15 years. I do a lot of research and solidarity work with people in the Caribbean who are on one of the front lines of climate breakdown. Cheers.
Brilliant. And then Livvy, do you want to go in next?
Hi, I'm Livvy Hanks. I'm here as a member of Green New Deal Norwich, which is a local hub of Green New Deal UK. Green New Deal UK was set up last year to support organising and campaigning on a non-party political basis for a Green New Deal within the UK. And I also work on climate campaigning in my day job, which is for Quakers in Britain.
Brilliant, thanks for that. So just looking through the people we've got in today, our sort of audience, as it were. I think most of you have been to UEA Labour events before, but a couple of you haven't. So just to run through usually how we structure them, the first half is made up of set questions and discussion points that I'll put to our guests, and that it will be a quite sort of a free discussion. So if you've got something you want to kind of interject on, feel free to kind of to just sort of pop something in the chat. And then for the second half of it, we will then sort of move to a Q&A format to sort of open the discussion even more up to you and see what other ideas you want to kind of bring to the table. So I think just to get started, also just remember to say this is being recorded just to pop up on our YouTube channel, because we have a lot of members who are, for whatever reason, aren't able to attend all of our events in person. So it's nice for them to be able to access these discussions after the fact. So yeah, please do just bear that in mind. Okay, so to begin with, we've kind of changed what we do. Instead of asking just purely questions, we've got a couple of statements prepared. I'm going to read out and then go through our panelists in turn and let them sort of reflect upon it and give us their take. So the first one is: a Green New Deal will unfairly impact the poorest in society, disproportionately expecting them to change their behaviours and not putting enough emphasis on the powerful. So Livvy, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think this is a useful provocation to start with, because I would say that essentially the Green New Deal is precisely the opposite of this, in that it's very clear that we need to focus on systems and not individual behaviour change. So Green New Deal UK has 5 kind of core principles which it sets out that underpin any version of a Green New Deal. And at the heart of that is absolutely clear that this is a plan to address the twin crises of inequality and climate breakdown, and never one without the other. And I think a couple of the other 5 principles also kind of speak to this concern, one of which is that a Green New Deal will create good jobs, and that's about providing people with a decent income that they need to live on, and it's also about getting the work done that needs to be done for a transition, a just transition, and about providing people with meaningful work and a way to contribute, which I think is what the majority of people want. And finally, I would say that it's a Green New Deal is about transforming the economy, and that's also is the third of the 5 principles of Green New Deal UK. This is about transforming the economy to serve people and planet, and restructuring our economy around that goal rather than around massive profits for the tiny few. So this is absolutely about taking on power and vested interest. There won't be a Green New Deal without a massive transfer of wealth and power and ownership away from the 1%. And that 1% are also the biggest emitters, so there's that as well, that we know that the richest 1% of the population globally produce more than twice the carbon emissions of the poorest, I think 3 billion globally. So, the disparity there is absolutely enormous. So I think this is absolutely about a focus on the powerful, about shifting power and ownership, and behaviour change is key, but we need structures in place to enable that. It's hopeless telling people they shouldn't drive their car if they, for instance, if they live in a place, they live miles from their work in a place with no public transport. So yes, we're all going to have to change our behaviour, but we need public investment, we need structures that enable that, and that's what a Green New Deal is all about.
Brilliant, thanks for that. I think there's often, sort of people have quite a cynical approach to any kind of political idea, and quite reluctant to perhaps engage with the idea that it could actually provoke real change and be meaningful. So Leon, did you have anything else you wanted to add or contest on that?
I guess I'd echo a lot of what Livvy said. I think the hope is that there are lots of different versions of Green New Deals that are being put forward. The fact that you've got the Tories, who had a literal fossil fuel lobbyist as their manifesto author in the last general election, and the fact that you've got like the lesser of two evil of the evil of fossil capital parties in the US, the Democrats, kind of pushing a version of a Green New Deal. Of course, like you said in the introduction, we've got a lot to be thankful for from one of their more progressive activists, AOC. But the fact that you have these two kind of big sort of parties who have no interest in the kind of radical change that Livvy outlined as being essential should give us pause. It should give us, it should alert us to the risks of kind of the risks of what the statement suggests. So the idea that it will be the poorest who feel the biggest impact, and that they'll be the ones kind of having to change, and the powerful will kind of further entrench their power. That's certainly a danger of some versions of a Green New Deal. Whether or not they're versions of the Green New Deal that are worthy of the name, I mean, that's something we could contest. But I guess I'm optimistic that some of the theory and politics behind versions of the Green New Deal, such as the kind of socialist policies of Labour for a Green New Deal, or versions of a global Green New Deal that are being developed by people like War on Want, I'm more hopeful that these versions are exactly about, as Livvy said, kind of making, redistributing power and resources within society, so that it's addressing the root causes of climate breakdown, which is a system. It's like Livvy said, it's not an individuals, it's a system. So any version of the Green New Deal that's worth defending will have at its heart an understanding of the systemic nature of climate breakdown and of the crises that it's connected to, and it will address those. And in doing that, it will have to, I think, impact or redistribute power away from the powerful, the wealthy, and towards those who are poorest in society. But yeah, we should be cautious. We should be attentive to the co-option of at least the rhetoric, if not the actual meaningful policy.
Definitely, and that's definitely something that we kind of are seeing now with the Conservatives adopting, the term, green, green industrial revolution, them kind of literally nabbing that straight from the Labour book, quite a blatant attempt at sort of greenwashing. So Chris, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, I guess for me, obviously I agree with both what Leon and Livvy said. But yeah, I think one thing that I'd like to underline is, the statement you read out was kind of around, changes to behavior and how that relates to kind of putting the pressure on the powerful. I think large chunks of the environmental movement have been dominated by kind of behavior change strategies and politics. And I think that's been on the whole a bad thing, because it, just doesn't face up to the scale of the crisis that we face, its nature as a systemic crisis. And, the implication is correct that it puts the emphasis on ordinary people rather than the powerful who are actually profiting from the system. What I would say is, I think a Green New Deal, if we're talking about transforming the economy, and maybe it won't change behaviors, but it will change how we live in some ways, maybe. But I think for me, what I always like to say is that I think one of the reasons why a Green New Deal is so appealing is that hopefully the transformations it would include would make those behavior changes the easiest choices. So, right now, if when we, if we moralize about the type of food that we eat or the type of travel that we take, actually very often what's being asked of people is to make the harder decision, the more expensive decision, the more inconvenient decision. But I think if we look at this from a kind of systemic perspective, we can say, how are we structuring the economy so that the cheapest, most accessible food is the most sustainable food right the way through the supply chain? How, if we're looking at traveling, wherever that might be, within or between countries, it's that the cheapest, most pleasurable, luxurious form of transport is low carbon, rail, public transport, buses, rather than short haul aviation. So yeah, it's about, actually the Green New Deal for me is about making those choices actually so obvious, so easy that they're not choices, they're not behavior changes, they're just what you would do because the economy is structured in that way. And I think as well, just the quick thing I'd say is that one of the things that really appeals to me about the idea of a Green New Deal is that what you're saying is basic needs that people have in society, whether that's for food or energy or clean water or transport or a heated home or a place to live. We can address all of these and we can provide all of these things generally through the same measures that we will use to decarbonize the economy. So we can think about a national food service to guarantee food as a basic need, but also to use that to transform how our food systems work. We can have, through the provision of renewable energy, abolishing fuel poverty, making transport cheap, make it free, but do that by introducing low carbon transport. And there's all of these things, and ultimately this has to be part of a confrontation with fossil capital and the capitalists that profit from not just climate injustice, obviously climate injustice, but the kind of broader social and economic injustices too, because they're connected. And the very last thing I'll say on this is, certainly for Labour, for a Green New Deal, expanding democratic public ownership across the economy is a central part to all of this. We need to be stripping out the profit motive in as much of the economy as possible, because it's the profit motive that means that capital, corporations, they're not decarbonizing, but they're also running services, large sections of the economy, in a way that benefits themselves and not ordinary people. And the demands for public ownership are much more common sense in, for example, the trade union movement, the labor movement, than they are in the environmental movement. And so I think that's why I'm excited about the Green New Deal. It's a break from some of the kind of common sense logics of the climate movement, which I think are actually somewhat stunted in being able to face up to the scale of the crisis. It's about bringing in other political traditions to this question of climate injustice and climate crisis, and really drawing on those traditions of the labor movement and socialist movements as well to tackle this crisis.
Brilliant. I really like the use of the word luxury there as well, in terms of, instead of sort of presenting arguments as, we need to be sort of living in a cave and wearing rags and eating only food that was produced, just down the road from us. I think, laying out that positive vision of what society could be in a sustainable way is really important. Just a quick interjection, if you hear any bizarre sniffling noises, my dog's just come in. So he wants to get involved in the discussion too. He's a passionate environmentalist, Snoopy for the climate. So it actually leads on quite nicely to our second, I suppose, statement / question, which is on adaptation strategies. So just to sort of clarify for everyone watching, by adaptation strategies we mean things to do with learning to live with the environment being in the state it's in. So the statement is, adaptation strategies should be the focus rather than trying to stop the crisis itself. So Leon, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a risk of a kind of false dichotomy emerging between adaptation and mitigation in climate science, but also in climate politics. And I think that often, although not always, but often stems from a misunderstanding of the root causes of climate breakdown. So if we, as I think most of us on this call do, if we see that the climate crisis is being connected to how society is structured and organized, then the solution is less about greenhouse gas emissions, which tend to be the focus of the debate between mitigation and adaptation, the argument being that if you're going to mitigate, you need to reduce emissions. If you're going to adapt, then you need to build, I don't know, seawalls or flood barriers or other things. It's not to say that suite of actions aren't required, but to see them as being in competition with each other, I think misunderstands that the climate crisis is caused by a system of social organization, a set of political relationships, economic relationships. And so I think we can and we have to do both. We have to address the root cause of climate breakdown as being in terms of a global system or global systems of exploitation and exchange, which have emerged out of violent and extractive colonial processes, the same processes that made the modern world as it is today. And therefore, any kind of Green New Deal will only be able to address the root causes of those problems if it kind of addresses the legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and also the system of social relations and exchange that were embedded in their wake. So yeah, we can look at, for instance, the energy sector as an example, and we can think about how if we see adaptation and mitigation as being in conflict with each other, then perhaps if we were to prioritize mitigation, we might say, well, we need to decarbonize the energy sector. We need to switch entirely to renewable energies. And we might neglect the ways in which the pursuit of decarbonized energy infrastructure might actually make adaptation for people, say in the global south, who live near sites of rare earth mineral extraction. It might make their adaptation harder because you're not changing any of those underlying social relations that mean that those people don't have autonomy over and control over their lives, and don't have access to the power, the decision-making tools that would enable them to push back against kind of land being seized from them by local governments or by companies who are then pursuing the rare earth minerals that are required for decarbonization. If, on the other hand, we see the two as connected, then I think we are able to both adapt and mitigate. And I think they both start with reorganization of society rather than with particular tools and techniques, although reorganizing society will make pursuit of those tools and techniques that are required for both adaptation and mitigation easier, I think.
Thank you, that's brilliant. I mean, I think you make a really good point in that it's always tempting to draw these kind of false dichotomies. And really, what we need to be recognizing is that, we've seen the extent of the climate crisis already unfolding, and although we need to act radically and boldly to sort of curtail that, to some extent is, I suppose, going to be sort of damage limitation. The damage has already gone on for too long and it's gotten too far. So Chris, do you have anything you wanted to add on that or build upon?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I entirely agree with Leon on that, and I think the point that it shouldn't be a binary between mitigation and adaptation is incredibly important. I think for me, one of the big reasons for that as well is that, if we look at, what are the reasons why we've not made sufficient, if any, progress on decarbonization, and what are the reasons why actually, as we're already experiencing a lot of really devastating climate impacts, and I say we in the broader sense because I'm not really at the moment, but whether it's wildfires or drought or flooding or resulting in the displacement of people, like lots of people are already experiencing this. Why aren't we adapting to that as well? As why aren't we mitigating? It's the same as Leon described, economic system. It's an economy that's organized around profit, that you know, frankly, investing in emergency services isn't a profitable endeavor. But you know, when we think about what's a socially just adaptation going to be, that, you know, it's not just, I think, building flood defenses and, you know, reinforcing buildings. It's, we need a massive investment in emergency services, and we need a massive investment in kind of community resilience. And actually, you know, in this country, if you just take this country alone, the last 10 years has been a politics defined by austerity. And, you know, what that has meant, the kind of side effect of that, has been a stripping away of state capacity that we've seen in this pandemic, has meant that we've been unable to deal with it in a way that has been humane and, you know, allowed us to protect human life. And I think actually what we'll see is, although the disaster will be different, I'm sure we'll see more pandemics in the next 100 years, but although the disaster might be different, what we'll increasingly see is these things that we've been able to predict and know that are coming for the last, you know, 30, 40 years, we'll continue to know are coming. We know are coming now. They will happen. Maybe we don't know specifically what or when, but they'll happen because we know they're going to happen, and we won't be prepared to deal with them on the ground. And so I do think that we need to, as well as thinking about what are the transformative kind of bold visions that are going to mitigate and stop this you know, crisis from happening, we need a reality check that, you know, these effects are already happening. They're only going to get worse, and frankly, we're not on track to stop it anytime soon. Every day, month, year that we don't reverse the tide of, you know, greenhouse gas emissions, we're locking ourselves and you know, obviously the most vulnerable, you know, already kind of persecuted, colonized people in the world into these effects. And so we need to be, you know, but ultimately it's the same transformations of the economy that is going to allow us to reverse that and adapt to what we're already locked into. So that's why we need to, you know, really bind them together. But, you know, really crucially, we need to be making sure that this is a socially just adaptation. You know, we can't just be adapting society for capital so that we can continue a kind of capitalist economy where, you know, corporations and the private sector can profit while ordinary people, working people, the global majority, are left for dead. You know, this needs to be a genuine transformation of the economy so that we have resilient emergency services, we have resilient infrastructure. Countries in the global north and those responsible for the crisis are financing loss and damage that's already happened, and, you know, financing those kind of adaptation and decarbonization measures around the world. But also, you know, on a kind of community level, like, I think what we've seen is communities through mutual aid and things stepping into the gaps left by the neoliberal state. And I think we as organizers need to be prepared to, at the same time as demanding these transformations, also building that community resilience, because it's only going to be more and more important, both, you know, where we live here in the UK, but also around the world, because, you know, there's a very good chance that we won't succeed in the transformations necessary to kind of face up to this.
Absolutely. And I mean, just sort of thinking about how communities have, you know, depended upon those sort of mutual aid groups and such with regards to coronavirus. Of course, there's going to be, you know, various other sort of similar health emergencies, be it, you know, pandemics that are related to climate change and such. You know, there's going to be, you know, this is just a taster of what we've got in store without wanting to be too pessimistic. You know, it's better to get the pessimism over at the beginning and then you get all hopeful at the end. That's usually the strategy. But yeah, Livvy, do you have anything you want to add?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think Chris has covered an awful lot of what I would have wanted to say, particularly around this, the damage done by austerity and the need for kind of building social infrastructure and building resilience that way. And I think a massive part of that is to come back to the point about jobs, that we need to be creating jobs, you know, more jobs in care and in education and structuring those around these needs. And those are green jobs as well. They're all part of this transition that we need, of this kind of society we're trying to build, that it isn't just about hard infrastructure, it's absolutely about that social infrastructure as well. I think a couple of things I could add in terms of sort of resilience at the local level. I think there are actually lots of things that local authorities could do. But there's just been no funding and no guidance provided in most cases for this, beyond a little bit around kind of flood defences, which is still often the only issue that's really dealt with, it's really kind of captured under adaptation at all in a lot of places. And in a lot of cases, local authorities' hands are tied by not being allowed to insist on higher standards than the national kind of baseline. So when you're thinking about planning, land use planning documents, you know, a lot of local authorities might want to include higher standards on water efficiency and things like that, but they're not allowed to. So there's a lot there that needs to change in the way that we that we approach that kind of decision making and policy making. I do think as well, though, I mean, obviously I agree with what both Leon and Chris said, that this is clearly not either or. You know, we absolutely need to be doing mitigation and adaptation, and we need to be paying attention to the third pillar of the Paris Agreement, which is loss and damage, compensating countries for the damage that has already been done that cannot be adapted. But I think, you know, we can never give up on minimising the impacts through cutting emissions. And I do think that kind of narrative that we hear sometimes of this kind of 10 years to save the world is quite problematic for that reason, that it sort of suggests an end date beyond which we'll have either done it or not, like in a film, you know, and that is just not how it's going to be. This is going to be an ongoing fight for all of our lives. It's not a case of we'll do it or we won't. There's not going to be a moment where we've won or a moment where we've lost. You know, we will work all our lives to make this, to minimize disaster and to build something better as much as we can. And I think it's worth being aware, I think, that we might see a shift in rhetoric in coming years towards a kind of, well, it's too late now, we've just got to adapt as best we can, because that suits a certain, to be honest, that suits a certain eco-fascist agenda that there'll start to be talk of, you know, closing borders, abandoning certain places as kind of sacrifice zones, which is all already happening. But I think the language of that might become much more explicitly framed around the climate crisis. And so I think that's something we really need to be alert to. Like, of course, we need to adapt, but we can't abandon the need to reduce our emissions rapidly to zero and to have a just transition. And so, yeah, I think we can't accept that framing ever.
Absolutely. I think, you know, we've already in recent times seen a huge rise in kind of eco-fascism and that particular sort of development on the hard right. And, you know, with the sort of growing sort of instability and the chaos that it ensues, we need to be, you know, proactively working to prevent that from escalating any further. So now I think we're going to move on to, we've got our three panelists will have sort of different specialities, I guess you'd say, different areas of specific interest. So they've each got like a specialised question to chat to us about. So we're going to start off with Leon. His question is, the power behind the Green New Deal has been, in part, its ability to marry social and environmental justice rather than sort of considering them as two opposing forces. However, groups like, you know, the largely white middle class Extinction Rebellion have some sort of betrayed this vision. So what should a socially just environmental movement look like?
Yeah, thank you. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, as we probably all have, as people who are active in social movements and want to build power in support of the kind of radical changes that we see as entirely necessary to secure the actions that we've been discussing. I think that to have any hope of being successful, we're going to have to build local grassroots power, and as we do that, I think we're going to have to nurture the kind of wider ranging understandings of climate breakdown that we've talked about today. So I think that one of the reasons why perhaps some people have been a bit unconvinced by some aspects of Extinction Rebellion's framing is that there have been that from time to time there's been a kind of reproduction of some of the problematic versions of environmentalism that we've also talked about as being an issue. So not seeing climate breakdown as a political issue, for instance, is one for me that well, it stuck in my throat, especially around the general election last year, when there was like such a need for an explicit endorsement of the kinds of political opportunity or kind of political choices that were available between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and for Extinction Rebellion nationally not to take a position on that, to me just seemed like a real mistake. Having said that, I know that there are lots of actors within Extinction Rebellion who are also out knocking doors and kind of campaigning for Labour, and would have seen Labour's policy around Green Industrial Revolution, Green New Deal, as being precisely a step in the right direction in terms of addressing the extinction. But yeah, we're going to have to do the hard work of campaigning alongside and with people who also want to see better worlds. The movement has to insist upon an understanding of climate breakdown that is expansive and that doesn't shy away from the fact that the climate crisis is deeply entangled with all of the other crises that we face. And I mean, that might seem quite daunting, and I think it's quite tempting to try and reduce climate breakdown to its kind of carbon emissions kind of immediate cause, because it seems so much to say, no, we need to kind of radically reorganize society. And I think on one level, of course, that's true. But on another level, I think we're much more likely to win people over who are either skeptical or who have a lot to gain and not so much to lose by trying to radically reshape society. I think we're more likely to win them over if we have a much more expansive vision of the future. I think that's what's so exciting and optimistic and hopeful about some versions of the Green New Deal, is that they're, as we talked about earlier as well, that they're hopeful. They offer a kind of more utopian, or at least more optimistic version of the future that I think is much more likely to win people over for support, to support them. So I think the environmental movement has to be, it has to be realistic about the root causes of the climate crisis, but that doesn't mean it has to be fatalistic. I think it has to also be optimistic and hopeful in terms of saying, well, no, these solutions that we're proposing are actually solutions that would improve life for the vast majority of the world's population. They would give people a bigger say in the decisions that affect their lives. They would require kind of freeing people from you know, the often mindless and mind-numbing forms of work and employment that too many people are trapped in. And so I feel like there's so many upsides that by insisting on a more expansive definition of climate breakdown, we actually have a lot of potential for carrying people with us, for persuading people of a more enriched version of society to come, and that will help to generate the support that we need.
Brilliant. I mean, I think something that just sort of came to mind as you were speaking was Rutger Bregman, a point that Rutger Bregman often makes. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's, you know, he talks about a study that was done into people kind of in managerial jobs, asking them, you know, does your job really matter? And you know, I think it was cited as, you know, it was put forward as something along the lines of, you know, is your job a bullshit job? And the overwhelming majority of them were like, my job has no value. You know, I'm paid to do things that aren't really contributing very much. I think, you know, we know that with the climate going the way it's going, over the next 10 years we're going to see a huge decrease in the number of jobs that there are, and that, you know, we need jobs that are going to be socially valuable and kind of abandon that workerism and that tendency to just say, let's get people doing these shit jobs because at least they're working and they're earning their daily bread or whatever it is. So no, I think, like, also couching it in that reality, that's, you know, the sort of neoliberals and the right, you know, who don't really take this crisis seriously, their, you know, our vision in some ways isn't that different to theirs. We're both, you know, what we're saying is that we shouldn't accept less people having jobs. We should, and therefore, you know, we shouldn't accept like a fall in living standards as a result of that. I think that's a really important point, because there we go. Because it's the, you know, the contrast that is often made is that, you know, the invoking this idea of sort of 1979 and the winter of discontent, and, you know, if you let the radical left get control of the economy, people aren't going to have jobs. We know that people aren't going to have jobs under the current system. So Livvy, I believe you've got the next question. Oh no, Chris, sorry, I got the order wrong. So moving on from that, we see the Labour Party hinting towards a less radical platform, particularly obviously with the election of Keir Starmer and, you know, all the events that have happened in the last 6 months that's making everybody pull their hair out. How do we as activists most effectively organise around justice in this new political landscape, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the pulling the hair out, and I'm surprised I've got so much left after the last 6 months. But there we are.
It's the curse of being
Maybe
a
not.
Labour Party member.
Yeah, and I'm a chair of a CLP as well, which is especially stressful. Yeah, I think what's important to understand is that I think Keir Starmer and the new leadership of the party, I think they're committed to, climate justice in some way, and I think they want the Labour Party to have a bold, ambitious climate platform. I think it's one of their priorities, probably. It's obviously important to understand that they have other competing priorities, and some of those priorities will, in some ways, conflict with the radicalness of, what it could be. But I think, I think it's important to understand that all of that, said, they don't have the political, the ideological tools to construct a, sufficient response to a climate crisis, to climate injustice, compared to the last leadership. And I think, we see that in Keir Starmer's leadership campaign, where he used the phrase Green New Deal more kind of freely than Jeremy Corbyn or Rebecca Long Bailey ever did. But what he did do is strip it of all of its kind of radical substance. Through pressure that we've been exerting and other people have been exerting. Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer this week actually have again restated the commitment for the kind of 2030 decarbonisation target, which obviously on its own is not enough, but it kind of, for me, kind of sets the pace for the ambition and the radicalness of all the other policies. But I think, the point I'm kind of trying to make here is that compared to the government, where the government, I think, would just be quite happy to put out some greenwash headlines, kind of mitigate for the attack line that they're not green enough, but fundamentally not do anything. I do think the Labour Party wants to be seen, but also from a kind of moral perspective, do right on climate, but they don't have the ideas. The Keir Starmer is from a political tendency within the Labour Party that certainly doesn't now, but hasn't really had any kind of anything propositional to say about how the economy should be organised. Certainly since the financial crisis, probably a few years before that as well. And so what it kind of, I think what it leaves us with the challenge of is creating a kind of common sense around the ideas that we're putting forward around climate justice and how it relates to social and economic justice as well. And there's a massive space for that. In some ways, this would be harder if the leadership of the Labour Party came from a clear, defined ideological standpoint that was opposed to us. Like if we were 20 years ago in the kind of political debate, if Keir Starmer was a signed up Blairite and was, really ideologically committed to, the free market economy and all of that, what Blairism represented, then it would be harder in some ways, because it would be that ideological debate, and in some ways it becomes harder to shift people. I've spoken about, expanding democratic public ownership across the economy, a kind of genuine internationalism that isn't just saying you love the EU and the COP process, a program of universal basic services. These are, I believe, these are all kind of fundamentally essential to any kind of climate justice emanating from the UK. I don't think that's where someone like Keir Starmer would naturally fall to. I don't think they're his intuitive positions, but I think what does exist within the Labour Party is quite a way into the right of the Labour Party, is making the case that these measures are necessary on the climate issue. And I think what the Green New Deal gives us the opportunity to do is make the case for things like public ownership, universal basic services, a mass program of green jobs, international reparations, all of these things in the context of climate justice, because these are people who want to do something about climate change, don't actually know what to do, and can look to us, and we can make these arguments over again, as almost the only game in town. And it's not like what we're saying is absurd. We can certainly, as we have been doing this evening, make a very clear case for why all of these things are very kind of common sense and necessary for the crisis. So how do we organize around it? I think we need to hold the leadership of the Labour Party to account when they look to row back on some of these things because, whether it's nationalisation commitments or whatever, they will feel pressure from various quarters to not be as radical as, the 2019 manifesto. But equally, if the next election is 2024, that's 5 years later than the last election. That's, almost 5 years of more radical policies that you need. So it's not just defending what we had, it's also about organising to go further. We've spoken about adaptation, all of those measures. That wasn't really in the last manifesto so much. We'll need to decarbonise more rapidly. We'll need the transformations to be more bold. We certainly need the kind of international action to be more ambitious and on a greater scale as well. So, and I think we don't know what's going to happen over the next few years in terms of the climate crisis, but I'm sure there will be more wildfires, there'll be more extreme weather events, there will be more devastation that will be more or less reported on depending on who it hits in the world. But I think we need to be taking advantage of those opportunities to be saying, if you want to be seen to be serious on these issues, then this is the suite of policies. This is what a Green New Deal is. You can't say you support a Green New Deal if it doesn't tick off X, Y, Z, because otherwise you're just kind of greenwashing. And that's the kind of frame that maybe we would go in with. But ultimately, that needs to be backed up by hard organising, and that needs to be, creating a common sense at a CLP level and a local level. It needs to be getting MPs on board and councillors on board. But I think more substantively, building power for the long term. I'm not making any predictions, it's very early, but it wouldn't surprise me if Labour didn't win the next election, given how Keir Starmer's conducting the party right now. And I can't see Keir Starmer staying on as leader if he loses the next election. That would his entire brand pitch of electability would be undermined. So I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen. I'm not saying I want it to happen. I want Labour to be in government in 2024. But I think as people who support these policies, we need to be taking that long view and saying, are we putting ourselves in a position so that in 2024, if there's a leadership election, these policies are the absolute common sense that anyone who wants to stand a chance of winning supports. We need power in CLPs across the country and local councils across the country so that we're ready to put someone in charge of a Labour Party who is ready to implement policies of this kind of nature, and then ready to elect them. And, beyond that, ready to defend them when they're implemented. I've seen a few things this week of what would have happened if Corbyn had have won. Well, the PLP probably would have revolted and Capital would have kicked up a massive fuss. National Grid already said that they were going to sue the Labour government if they plan to nationalise for National Grid. And actually, I don't think, I think we'd have made some progress, but we didn't have the civil society, social movement capacity to actually defend those policies. We need a militant trade union movement that's prepared to take industrial action for climate justice. We need a militant social movement that is prepared to mobilise hundreds of thousands of people to the street in defence of, democratic public ownership in the name of climate justice. And we need an active Labour Party membership that is prepared to stand up to any rollbacks. Because, if a Labour government gets into power, then it's going to be the most conservative, capitalistic elements of the state on one side, and we need to be as strong, if not more, in making sure that we, keep to those commitments. So yeah, it's obviously a big challenge, and we do need to be doing that work of defending what we have, pushing it further, but there needs to be a long game of building power as well, because there's no point in electing a Labour government if you're just, if it will then roll over on its tummy as soon as the state says, no, actually, we won't let you transform the economy.
Absolutely. I think, sorry, I thought I'd unmuted there. No, absolutely. I think the unapologetic radicalism is like a really key tenet. We need to be able to hold on to that hope as a movement, so that we're able to keep fighting and keep pushing rather than rolling over. So that links in quite nicely to our last question for Livvy. As somebody who has a lot of experience in activism, specifically in and around Norwich. According to many predictions, within the decade, swathes of Norfolk will be underwater, as will large chunks of the UK more broadly. What should the focal point of our local activism be?
So I think the point about building power is just as relevant whether you're within a political party or outside that structure. And I think we need to do that across civil society. And that takes time and you can't skip it. So we end up with this real tension between the massive urgency of the situation, which a lot of activists in the sort of Extinction Rebellion side of things have been stressing. And obviously, you know, Greta Thunberg famously said, I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to panic. And I mean, she was talking to decision makers, and that's slightly different, but I still think, I get the point about the urgency, but I think actually I don't agree with that, because panic means you make bad decisions. And what we need to plan properly, we need to build power. And, you know, there's been a lot of missed opportunities in the UK environment movement because it has not put that work in, it has not had that focus and that kind of power analysis. So I think there is a huge amount of work to do. That said, there's lots and lots of people involved in this movement now, and I think we do need a kind of movement ecosystem. So, for instance, in Norfolk, some campaigners are focused on stopping basically a massive dual carriageway over the River Wensum through an area of special scientific interest, which is, you know, has been massively contentious for a number of years and is still very much an ongoing battle. And I think that's really a really important campaign. And absolutely, you know, a Green New Deal does not have a place for, you know, large scale road building. And so we would definitely be against that road. But I think that for Green New Deal, our focus should be on building a positive vision as well that connects with people's immediate concerns, that we need to be stopping the bad stuff, but we also need to be putting forward our vision for what we want instead, and in a way that, as I say, connects with where people are at and their immediate concerns in their lives. So on the sort of visioning side, one of the first things we did as Green New Deal Norwich, we've only been going since the summer. We ran an event in September focused around kind of the concept of Build Back Better and what that looks like in Norwich. And so inviting people to think about what changes have we seen, what struggles have we seen any positive changes during the lockdown that we would like to keep, and how do we make Norwich into more of the city that we want it to be. And coming out of that, there's kind of a couple of campaigns or work areas that we're planning to focus on over the next several months. One of which is around a Green Jobs for All campaign, which was launched a couple of weeks ago by Green New Deal UK. So that's part of a national campaign. And Green New Deal UK published a report showing that, you know, there's obviously a massive number of jobs at risk after because of COVID, and there are businesses that are not just going to be able to get back to where they were. But actually, with the right investment in a transition, we can create, I think it's 1.2 million jobs in the short term and about the same again in the longer term with a green recovery. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, including care jobs and not just the kind of hard infrastructure type jobs. And it's interesting to see in other parts of the country work starting to happen around some kind of reports and kind of case studies around what a just transition means and how we get there. So there was some great work done by Platform a little while ago, a few months ago, where they'd kind of done some work, a survey with oil workers, and found that I think it's about 3/4 of oil workers want to transition into renewables, but they haven't got the opportunities and the training aren't there. So, it's a really obvious sort of case study of a sector, which is also a big employer in Norfolk, that people want to make that transition, but at the moment, the structures aren't there to help them do it. So we want to explore some similar ideas locally, potentially around oil and gas, but also some of the other kind of industries that need to change, and the jobs that could be created. So that campaign is, we're just getting going on the kind of planning stage, but I think this focus on jobs is a real way of connecting with the concerns that people have right now. And then the second sort of area that we're focusing on is around food strategy. So this was something that came up a lot in the visioning event I mentioned, was around issues around local food systems. And I think there's really interesting work to be done bringing together different groups across Norwich and the surrounding area who are kind of working on this from different angles. Because of course there's the issue of immediate relief from food poverty, which is a big problem. There's significant levels of deprivation in parts of Norwich. But also kind of issues around better access to fresh food, to growing space, teaching cooking skills, and then the kind of supply chain stuff, local procurement, support for agroecological farming, the whole kind of spectrum of food issues. And I think some local areas have worked on putting together a food strategy, and that's something that we're hoping to pursue as Green New Deal Norwich. So these are not necessarily you know, they're not kind of campaigns against something in maybe that traditional sense, but they're kind of projects that are looking at building more positive alternatives that address some of the big underlying issues that we have locally. We are just getting started, and we know that we need to do better at reaching people where they are. So we've certainly found that the people who've got involved so far do fit that. They're coming largely from a kind of environmental concern background. It does have quite a middle class feel to it. So we really want to make sure that we're connecting to more the immediate struggles, and that we're aware of class dynamics in our work. And we know that's something that, you know, we need to get right. And I would, obviously you're Labour Party activists, but if you feel like getting involved in some non-party political activism as well, you'd be more than welcome to get involved. And if it's all right, I might post the links in the chat in a moment. I'd just quite like to say one more thing, which is that, you know, I'm not a Labour Party member, and so speaking to you as Labour activists, I do think it's really important that you push Labour to do better. And obviously Labour for a Green New Deal have done an amazing job on that in a short space of time. And I think here locally, you know, we're seeing very visible, brilliant work from Clive Lewis, who's obviously a very prominent supporter of the Green New Deal. But we've also got councillors in Norwich who back the massive road building scheme I was talking about, who back airport expansion. You know, there was a motion, I think it was around the kind of Declare a Climate Emergency campaign a little while back, where some Labour councillors were expressing scepticism and saying, you know, the Green Party wants climate austerity and this kind of thing. So that framing of it's the environment or the economy is still very much at play in parts of the Labour Party, I think. And I think that it's really time to move on from that. And hopefully with the help of local activists, you know, we can put across some of those positive visions that are happening in other places. You know, local councils' powers are limited, but there are amazing things that can be done that we see with like the famous Preston model around community wealth building, seeing interesting things in Hackney around active travel, also in Lewis District Council, which is now run after many years of Tory rule, it's now run by a Green Labour Lib Dem coalition. And interesting things are happening there around changes to their kind of overall planning and, you know, development plans and corporate plan. So I think there are examples around the country of how councils can show vision and can do things differently. So yeah, I guess that would just be my call to action for this group of people, is whether it's through the Labour Party or whether it's through Green New Deal, you know, please do get involved and push for changes for the better in the local area as well as nationally.
Absolutely, I think I would definitely urge everybody watching to, you know, particularly if you've got a bit more time on your hands, with continually going in and out of lockdown. Do get involved in sort of in local climate activism. I used to be a city council candidate, so I was sat in a lot of these discussions where you'd hear supposed Labour councillors, you know, arguing in favour of airport expansion. And I think it really speaks to kind of a failure of the discourse around climate for so long, that it's, you know, become for some people so inherently linked to you know, sort of middle classes and to elitism. And, you know, detach from the idea of fighting for working people. I think having that visionary aspect and, you know, keeping that hope alive, and it is a really, really critical thing. So we have got a couple of questions that have just popped up into the chat, actually. So I'll just, for the second half of this, for the Q&A, I'll just ask them now. So Callum has asked, maybe it's hard to predict right now, but do you think COVID-19 and the subsequent economic fallout has made the possibility of large-scale economic and social transformation in the UK seem more or less likely? So we can do a free-for-all. Whoever wants to take that first can go for it.
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first thoughts would be like, I think there was, I mean, short answer, yes. You know, it seems reasonably obvious that, you know, some of the most polluting industries like the aviation industry, the oil industry, they've experienced like serious shocks during the pandemic, and, you know, the shutdown of the economy, the unemployment crisis that is really still looming. We're beginning to feel it, but is really still looming. These are all, you know, major economic shocks that we weren't expecting, that gave us an opportunity to really change how large sectors of the economy, but, you know, realistically, the possibilities of a stimulus or a recovery, a green recovery as it's been called, gave us the opportunity to really change how the economy works. And I think it would be nonsensical to be recovering from this pandemic and not have climate justice and all the rest of it be a massive part of that, because how we rebuild or recover from this pandemic is going to define what our economy looks like for the next 10, 20 years. We saw the response to the financial crisis in 2008 defining the next decade or so of the economy. And so it's almost like we've been presenting with this opportunity to change how the economy works, deal with the pandemic, but also begin to tackle this kind of great issue of the climate crisis that's so kind of interlinked, with so many other elements of the economy. I think the difficulty is that we're now 8+ months since lockdown really kind of began in this country. And time's warp, sorry if my timings are a little bit wrong there, but I think what we've seen is on the whole, various institutions, in particular the government, have not taken the opportunity. And so I think actually that opportunity for that large-scale transformation is kind of slipping away. The government obviously was more interested in preserving the status quo, profitability as much as possible. The Labour Party refused, under Keir Starmer's leadership, certainly refused to, even advocate kind of bold transformational policies, even if they didn't kind of have access to the levers of state power. The trade union movement did a great job of winning concessions like the furlough scheme, and again, like protecting the interests of workers in this, but it doesn't have the confidence or the culture or the strategy to actually make that more propositional step and demand that this moment was used for transformations and really changing how the economy works for workers, not just protecting their immediate interests. And again, the climate movement as a whole, I just don't think has the power, the political power, the people power to make demands for a green recovery, to build back better, whatever formulation it is. They've been put forward, but there just hasn't been, the climate movement is, I think, reasonably structurally stunted to be able to actually force those issues in a kind of moment of crisis, because of the way it's organized itself. So yeah, it's disappointing. I think there's still scope, there's still time for the Labour Party or the government or whatever to change how they respond to this. But honestly, I think the opportunity, as I said, is slipping away from us, which is deeply unfortunate.
Sorry, do either of you, Livvy or Leon, have anything else to add to that, or anything you might disagree with? Or
I'd like to, I think, mildly disagree. I mean, I definitely sympathise with the feeling that this is slipping away, because I think there were so many kind of radical ideas being put forward, and it was a moment of crisis and a lot of hardship and distress for a lot of people. But I think there was also a feeling in the kind of early summer that there were ideas out there and there was a real possibility of kind of change. And I do have a feeling of that slipping away. That said, I think, unfortunately, I think we're in for a really, really long economic crisis, because we've got, the fallout from COVID. This is going to go on for a really long time. At the same time, we've got the hit from Brexit coming in January. There's a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability, but we know we're going to see a lot of unemployment, already seeing high levels of poverty. And I think the question is, in that context of kind of hardship and like awful kind of social outcomes, does that lead us to activism, or does that just lead us to apathy and despair? And I think that's a really hard question, but to an extent, I think we have to believe that the answer's up to us. And this is what our struggle is all about. And as the whole kind of purpose of this discussion has been, I think, that's the climate struggle as well, because all of these things are interconnected. And if we want to make those big structural changes, it has to be about building power. And at the moment, that has to start with those immediate issues that people are experiencing right now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just to kind of, I never missed an opportunity to quote Tony Benn. So the way you get change is the burning flame of anger against injustice and the burning flame of hope at a better world. So I do think that we do potentially run the risk of sort of falling into this malaise and thinking that it's, not to ever deny the seriousness of the situation we're in and the bastards that we've got in power. But, I think keeping that sense that it's worthwhile to keep fighting is very important. Leon, do you have anything you wanted to add, or? That's no problem at all. I've got another couple of questions in the chat, I think. Question from Alex for Leon specifically. Please, can you recommend some text, speakers, resources about the relationship between the colonial extraction and climate breakdown?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find a couple, and I'll share them in the chat. I've written about it a little bit. I know of other people who've written about it. So yeah, happy to share some of those resources. I mean, I think it is something that's not, in spite of how kind of obvious it often feels or seems to many of us, it also hasn't been written about in academic scholarship as much as perhaps it should have. But I'll put some things in the chat.
Absolutely. I mean, hopefully it will become sort of more of a prominent sort of feature as academia kind of slowly becomes, less and less sort of colonial. I've also got another question, which I've just lost. There we go, from Ellie Scott. Do you think a Green New Deal in the UK can be used to achieve regional equality by using it to rebuild former industrial heartlands? So who wants to take that? Chris, do you want to go for it?
I can, but I don't want to jump in ahead of anyone else. Don't want to go first again. Okay.
No, I think you're good. You're the brave one.
Yeah, I mean, it has to. I mean, it's one of those things that if a Green New Deal in the UK isn't addressing, regional inequalities that we've seen really develop over many decades, but certainly over the last 40 years with neoliberalism, then it's probably not going to be worth it, right? I think we all know that the city of London in particular, is a massive source of global wealth power that fuels inequality both within this country and around the world. And I think then there seriously needs to be a reckoning with that way of organizing the economy, like some of the institutions that exist within the city of London, whether that's insurance companies and markets like Lloyd's of London. They're responsible for providing insurance for just the dirtiest, most most alien fossil fuel extractive projects around the world. The Lloyd's market is kind of the last to go to place if a project like a big mine or like a Adani in Australia can't get insurance from anywhere else. They go to Lloyd's in the city of London because they know they'll get it there. Same with banks, whether it's high street banks like Barclays or HSBC or BlackRock or any other financial institution. Like if they're in the city of London, the odds are they're financing and they're profiting from these extraction projects around the world. And that that's a huge bit of the city of London's economy, and it's set up essentially to be a hub of financing these elements of the global economy that really are anti-democratic, have human rights abuses laden right the way throughout them, as well as driving the climate crisis. So taking on that bit of our economy, it's a huge bit, constitutes a huge amount of GDP, but it also sucks economic capacity. It sucks cultural, social, political life out of other parts of the economy and in the country. And the opportunities of a Green New Deal, the promise of a Green New Deal in part is, all of those green jobs, well paid, secure, unionized, in new, green sustainable industries, whether that's manufacturing, whether that's clean energy, but basic services as well. The Green New Deal, I think what's really important for me about the Green New Deal and green jobs, it's not just those stereotypically green industries, it's about rejuvenating the entire economy. And that's going to be the case in regions that have been deindustrialized and that have been really abandoned by the economic elite as much as possible. So for me, it has to be, I'm from Liverpool and spent a lot of time in my life in Sheffield, like whether it's the north, whether it's Wales, wherever, but there's parts of this country that have been really just are industrially desolate, where structural unemployment is so deeply rooted that that's as big a social economic issue in this country as any other. And it would be remiss, and actually you're not gonna achieve what you want to achieve unless you tackle that head on.
can I add a little bit to that? I think I want to pick up, I liked Chris's point about this can't just be about reviving old industries, because I do think I want to sound a bit of a note of caution around some of this framing. Personally, I'm not keen on the term green industrial revolution, because I think we can't just rerun the industrial revolution. You know, that was, it's not just about let's have business as usual, but everything's electric. You know, that is not going to address our problems. This is a kind of an issue of, as we've been over tonight, an issue of economic and social relations. And you know, the first industrial revolution was built off the back of an empire, you know, in the slave trade, and that's thankfully not quite where we are now, although many legacies of that remain. And I just think that framing around the industrial revolution for me is not particularly helpful. I do think there's obviously lots that is needed in terms of you know, infrastructure around renewable energy, and that there is a lot of opportunity there in currently quite, you know, deprived areas that have been suffered from massive underinvestment over the last decades. But I think we have to be careful to avoid the temptation to rush into a kind of growing our way out of crisis mindset, because I think that's what the Tories are going to be doing in the sort of red wall seats. They're going to try and kind of, you know, win, like essentially buy votes in those seats by pouring money into projects there, which might bring some of the things we need in terms of, you know, transition to renewable energy, but it's not going to bring about the kind of fundamental transformation in our approach to work and our approach to, you know, ownership that we actually need. So I think, you know, this isn't about going back to a culture that was also very exploitative, you know, it's very sexist as well, very kind of macho culture. So I think, yes, we still need to talk about industry, of course, but actually there's so much more that needs to be done. There are so many jobs that can be created that will exist around the country, which is also much more, you know, resilient. It's less dependent on a single industry when we're talking about things like retrofitting, things like farming, things like teaching, you know, things around public transport. These are jobs that need to exist in every part of the country. So yeah, I guess a slightly yes and no answer.
Absolutely, I hear what you're saying. I think actually it's also quite interesting in terms of, you know, in terms of building something new rather than harking back to kind of the old kind of worker right rhetoric. It also provides like a really interesting intersection where we can, you know, use the Green New Deal to also sort of advance ideas around mental health and around well-being, and kind of build a culture that supports people more readily, and is less based upon, you know, whether you've made enough, you know, national insurance contributions because you haven't worked enough so you can't access these benefits and things. It's like reframing the economy and considering, you know, people's well-being as being paramount. I think it provides a really good opportunity for that. I think that's pretty, unless you've got anything to add to that, Leon. I know it's not specifically your area really, but in that case, that's all the questions done with. So thank you so much for everybody for coming. It's been great, especially our three panelists. You've all been brilliant. In terms of the things that you've popped, the resources that you popped in the chat, I'll copy and paste that and also pop it on our social medias. So it can sort of reach people who are going to be watching this retrospectively. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much everybody for coming again. I'll let you all go and enjoy your dinners now.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
No problem. The take-home message is save the world.